Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is the psychologist Paul Bloom, author of many books, including most recently Psych, the Story of the Human Mind. We spoke about how morality develops in babies, the connection between disgust sensitivity and moral intuition, and why empathy is often a bad thing. In the extended version of the episode, we also spoke about BDSM and pornography and whether people might be drawn to violent porn for the same reason they're drawn to horror films and true crime. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the bonus episodes I do with my husband, the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, and also the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Okay, Paul, I wanted to start with a question which will sound a bit strange, but I think you'll understand what I'm getting at. Why do we sometimes get the urge to eat really cute babies?
That's a great beginning. First, thank you for having me on. And I should say that it's a real pleasure. I'm a fan of your writing and your ideas.
Oh, thank you.
This is a thrill. I'm interested in babies, and I'm also interested in weird desires, perverse desires, and the desire to eat babies is a strange one. It's not a genuine desire, but there's been studies and anthropological cross-cultural analyses, and actually the world over, people often pick up a baby and say, "You're so cute, I want to eat you up." And they start maybe gnawing on the baby's toes. And, we're so used to it, we don't find it as shocking as you might expect. Nobody knows exactly why, but one idea is that sometimes you get so caught up in a feeling that it's overwhelming, and you have to kind of push back with kind of an opposite feeling. So this is it gets too extreme. When those old clips about the Beatles coming by and these young girls shrieking, people laughing inappropriately or crying when they get good news, and crying is normally a sign of grief. And maybe the baby thing is more, you're so overwhelmed with the cuteness, you kind of bring up something which is more or less its opposite, which is appetite, to kind of calm yourself down. The baby is so cute, you just explode. That's a horrible non-psychological way of explaining it, but so, and a fancy way of saying, you started off by asking me a question I don't fully know, but I think the answer might have to be with the fact that in some way eating something is the opposite of loving it.
And also that tendency to kind of screw yourself up and screw up your forehead, screw up your fists and so on when you're sort of overwhelmed with something being cute. Is that also that feeling of having explosive emotions that you sort of have to express physically?
That's right. And it's a good question because it brings together two things. One is sort of evolutionary science 101, which is we find babies adorable. If we didn't find babies adorable, we really would eat them or abandon them, at least when they became too troublesome. So that's sort of a very simple question, and then combines it with an honest mystery, something which is specifically human and kind of weird. And that's kind of my own interests tend to fall somewhere around those two things, between sort of what makes total sense from evolution and what's more mysterious.
Okay, sticking with the babies theme, because you wrote a book some years ago, Just Babies, which is about the development of morality in young children. What can we learn from doing little morality plays for 1-year-olds with puppets?
Yeah, I've long been involved in research looking at the origins of morality, and a totally common view, and not a crazy view, is that there's no origin of moralities for babies. Morality is what you have to learn. And, you learn it through culture, you learn it through your parents, but you don't start off thinking anything is right or wrong. And this is a very popular view through history. I think many people listening to this would hold it, but it's probably mistaken. Um, Again, analyses of how evolution works, looking at other primates, finds that some idea it is adaptive to some extent to start off with some degree of a moral sense. And so, a lot of people have been exploring that. Well, one way to explore this was done in Yale, my collaborators, Karen Wynn and Kylie Hamlin. And what we would do is we'd get a baby. We'd have the baby sitting on the parent's lap, typically the mother, and the baby would watch a play. And maybe in one play, a character would be struggling to get up the hill, and another character would help it. Then a third character would push it down. Or a character is trying to open up a box, and one character would open a box with it. The other one would jump on the box and stop it from opening. And we find that babies by like 6 months of age, and it's not that younger ones can't do it, it's just that it's harder to test younger babies. But babies by about 6 months of age prefer the good guy, and they don't like the bad guy. In other studies with older babies, with 1-year-olds, we find they usually like to punish the bad guy. And one idea is this speaks to human moral universals. There's a lot of ways in which our morality differs within a society, across societies. There's some fundamentals. And one fundamental is all things being equal, someone who helps is good, someone who hinders is bad.
And not even someone who helps you. So this is children seeing someone helping some third party, and they consider that to be preferable to someone hurting a third party.
That's right. And that makes it interesting, I think, because if I'm a baby and I tend to be drawn to somebody who helps me, well, that's simple, survival. It's simple to my benefit. You don't have to appeal to morality to talk about that. But if I see third parties interact and respond accordingly, then it becomes more interesting. And there's even work with older kids, looking at fairness. And around the age of 1.5, if baby sees somebody distributing like candies, and in one situation, he distributes to 2 people, one gets 2, the other one gets 2. In a different situation, one gets 3, and the other one gets 1. Babies are drawn to the character who distribute them evenly, fairly. And again, as you point out, this is their response to other characters dealing with other people. They're not involved, but still they judge.
What seem to be some of the universals there? So babies are interested in people who like they like people being helpful. They like fairness, some degree of egalitarianism. Are there any other universals which we see cross-culturally?
There's some other studies finding that they could take intent into account. So if somebody does something bad, but by accident, it's very clear as an accident, babies don't take it as much of a black mark as if it was done on purpose. And again, this is very simple interactions like hitting or hindering or helping. You also find, this is all sort of when I'm talking about our studies, which look at babies' responses to things. You also look at babies' own emotions. So pretty early on, they're upset by seeing someone else suffer. You have the rudiments of what you call compassion or empathy. Then in the first year, you develop sort of moral outrage, getting angry at unfairness. Later on, you get emergence of emotions like gratitude and blame and so on. And I think these are all universals. I think the foundations of morality are kind of baked into our species by evolution. But some people hear me say this, and then they say, oh, wow, so you're just saying morality's all innate. You don't have to do anything about it. But of course, that's wrong in a couple of ways. First thing, part of what we have by evolution is stuff which we may not be so happy with. We have a very powerful in-group bias. Study after study after study, and also sort of common sense says we favor our own over others, our own family, our own community, our own ethnicity over others. And there's good evolutionary reasons why this is so. But sometimes as reflective creatures, we could say, well, we don't want to be that way. Evolution's got us wrong. We want to do things better. And then another limitation is there's all sorts of moral insights we've come across as in a society that weren't baked in by evolution, but we think are great, like slavery is bad. Men and women should have equal rights. and so on. So I think the foundation is there, but there's a lot more that has to come in.
Is it possible that babies have the morality blueprint, which we see in young babies, is one that is well suited to the ancestral environment? So I'm thinking of something like egalitarianism. My understanding is that there is, of course, variation, but the hunter-gatherer groups tend to be more egalitarian than very large, complex societies, which tend to be more hierarchical. Is it possible that we are sort of primed for hunter-gatherer morality, but then we have to have different moral systems taught and imposed on top of that?
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right. I think a lot of the story of evolution in general is our minds have been primed for hunter-gatherer life, and now we're in a modern world with billions of people and all sorts of interactions with strangers and technology, and sometimes it really serves us very, very badly. And you're right as well. So you could have an extremely egalitarian society like extremely non-egalitarian society like North Korea, where it's huge differences between the powerful and the powerless. Hunter-gatherer societies, because so much was face to face, because there were no guns, there was no way a single person could hold 100 people paralyzed with fear. They tend to be more egalitarian, though. I'll sort of qualify that with they were egalitarian in certain ways, but regarding male-female relationships, they probably weren't. There probably were I think that the leaders of these groups are even the people who had more power tended to be men. And of course, they weren't egalitarian between adults and children.
I'm curious as to how this plays into disgust, because there's a bit in your most recent book where you write about disgust in young children and the fact that they don't have it, basically, that
Yeah,
they will eat terrible things. They
there's
are completely comfortable with their own feces, all this kind. I mean, anyone who's looked after young children will know this, right? And then at some point they develop. My son has recently crossed the threshold at the age of almost 3, where he starts to say that some things are yucky, but when they're little,
yeah.
they just don't think that. My understanding is that disgust seems to be quite an important moral emotion, in that it does guide our instinctive responses to certain moral questions. How do you think that plays in with young children? If they don't have that instinct, and of course some adults have a much higher disgust threshold than others too, does that limit their moral development until they do?
That's such a great issue. You can talk about two different types of disgust. You've nicely talked about them. One is physical disgust, and you're right. Babies don't have it. I mean, even imagine a baby who's disgusted at feces. Poor kid. Babies have enough troubles, but all of a sudden their whole body is just endlessly grossed out by themselves because they have no control over themselves. And then even later on, physical disgust takes a while to emerge. Paul Rosen did some experiments where he made something. He did it with cheese and something else, but basically he made something that was alarmingly like dog poo. And he'd tell kids, "This is dog poo," and a certain age say, "Yum," and they would just dig in. So, um, so that takes a while to kick in, and it probably kicks in when kids get more mobile and able to master their environments a bit. Moral disgust comes in, I think, even later, and I think it is universal. People will always describe certain acts as disgusting, but there's a big debate in psychology and philosophy where I have a strong view on this over whether moral disgust is a good thing. And I think it isn't. I think what moral disgust is kind of a happenstance connection between physical disgust and morality, that things we find physically gross, a lot of these which involve sex, are then taken as morally wrong. And so disgust as a moral guide has a terrible history. Laws against interracial marriage, laws condemning gay people to death have been almost often explicitly disgust motivated. And I think part of being and maybe you see it differently, so this is interesting, but part of being, to me, a mature moral being is to say, yeah, what those people do grosses me out. No doubt about that. But that's not enough to condemn them. I should just get over it.
I'm sure you're aware of these studies where they get on the subject of disgust and homophobia, where you hook up a bunch of straight men to blood pressure monitors and sweat receptors and all this fancy stuff that you can use to test people's physical stress, and then get them to look at images of men kissing each other and things like that. And uh, overwhelmingly, their disgust response is quite intense. This is even among men who say that they are not homophobic, men who are very politically liberal and so on. And the thing that I find so interesting about those studies is that it is clearly the case that most straight men just overcome that. That in our era, where homophobia is stigmatized.
I think that's a really good moral point. I actually think, in a sense, most sex is disgusting. It's if you're not yourself aroused by it, it can be, at minimum, kind of freaky watching people copulate, and at maximum, oh my God, this is I want to turn my head, I don't, but and it is true that male homosexuality tends to evoke the strongest reaction for both men and women. And of course, in history, it's male homosexuality has been a target of laws and campaigns. Female homosexuality is treated differently. Many men find it arousing. Many women find it, like, they could find it arousing. They don't seem to find it as upsetting. And it's an interesting question. Why? I mean, our moral repugnance that many people have towards gay people, it's kind of a puzzle from an evolutionary point of view. It's a genuine puzzle. You would think, since the engine that drives natural selection, survival, and reproduction, a man's response to knowing that another man in his group is not attracted to women should be delight, should be sending that guy flowers. This is great. Competition has gotten a little bit easier now. But instead, it freaks men out. And you might say that that's in part cultural, due to influence of religion, but it's kind of a puzzle. But anyway, I agree with your main point, which is that we have certain feelings at times. It might be that if I watch two very old people have sex, I would find that unpleasant to watch. Maybe I would find it disgusting. But you should say, fine, that's a fact about me. I should not now try to campaign for laws that make them go to prison for doing it. And nor should I believe it's wrong. There's a lot of things, there are a lot of foods I don't like. And if I was to watch somebody eat them, I would go, oh my God, it's disgusting. But I'm smart enough to know it doesn't make things wrong. I'm curious about something which I've often wondered about. Attitudes towards queer people, gay people, lesbians, and so on, trans people, have changed radically over the last 10, 20 years. I'm very curious. I bet the people you've asked maybe were over the age of 18. I wonder if you asked a bunch of, 18, 19, 20-year-olds what they would say.
Yes, interesting question. Can I tell you my theory as to why that change has happened as quickly as it has?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have a lot of evidence, but it's just kind of my hypothesis. It's that because of the influx of women into public life, it's because women seem to be less homophobic innately, for whatever reason. And when you have a lot more women in politics, in media, etc., having more cultural and political power, not only to set laws themselves, but also influencing the men around them. I mean,
Yeah.
This example of these men I asked who, do you feel secretly disgusted by homosexuality? And they had concealed this from me their whole lives, and and they were willing to share. But I think men are also have become more willing to conceal in public sentiments that women dislike. Yeah, my theory is it's to do with feminization of the
That's
culture.
super interesting. As you might know, Steven Pinker for a long time has been arguing that we've been going through moral progress, I think, quite convincingly in several books. And in his first book to discuss this, in Better Angels of Our Nature, he has these theories as to why. And he has many different theories for why, we've gotten better in so many ways. And one of them is what you're calling feminization, which is that sort of typically female values are getting more and more sway and more power. And sometimes people have argued this is for the worst. People have said that, we're going to say free speech culture, as women, at least in the United States, are less concerned about free speech and more concerned about people's feelings. And at the university level, this causes kind of a shift in norms and sometimes a shift in policies. But in other ways, women are just far less, on average, cruel, violent, sexually discriminatory than men. And I think this infusion of these values is all to the good.
I think it's both. I think it goes both ways. I think that there are ways in which culture is improved and ways in which it's damaged. I guess the thing that we don't know yet, because this is such a recent historical event, is whether it's sustainable. There may be elements of a feminized culture which are less durable for some reason. It just remains to be seen whether that's the case. But yeah, no, I think it's both, and I genuinely think, with the exception of something like sexual sadism or something, which doesn't seem to have any positives to it. Um, Male and female dispositions, I think, are just complementary. I think the yin and yang sort of conceptualization is a very useful one. And probably the ideal is a culture in which they are balanced against one another and there's a sort of dialectic. You probably wouldn't want to have a culture that was thoroughly feminized, I think. I think there would be big downsides to that.
I think certain male values are good. And you could talk about male values and female values sort of separate from men and women. Uh, Carol Gilligan had a famous book called In a Different Voice, where she said that the study of ethics and ethical development has been predominantly male. Here's a female way of thinking. And studies that came out later found, the so-called female way of thinking, it's not that women didn't necessarily tend to think that way, nor did men tend to adopt a male view. But I think the value there is that she identified a different way of doing morality that is sort of, I don't know, call it more female coded and otherwise than the male coded ways. And I agree with you. I think there's sort of a good diversity argument there, which is we benefit from both. In a society that falls, an all male society would be, I think, far too violent, far too obsessed with honor. Um, but I think an all female society might have less emphasis on sort of virtues involving autonomy, and rights, and more concerned about maybe too concerned about suffering in a way that kind of offsets this. So yeah, I agree.
I think also that female morality, if we want to call it that, places more emphasis on egalitarianism, which in some contexts is good, but in some contexts it's also bad. I had Corey Clark on the podcast a little while ago, and she was talking about I think it was her nieces who she observed playing, and they were playing a game where they took turns to win. Among the three of them, yeah, and it was a sort of a very classic girl game to play. Or boys apparently, according to the research on this, don't do that sort of thing. Like
No.
girls impose egalitarianism on their social groups much more readily and sometimes really fiercely than do men. And the problem is, we there are situations in which hierarchy is the most effective and productive structure available. Companies have CEOs, for instance, because they've arrived at the view that that's the best way of running a company. And yeah, the risk of having too aggressive egalitarianism is it stifles talented people. So yeah, I think it goes both ways.
I think that's right. I also think there could be a downside sometimes of too much of a concern for the suffering of individuals. So the sort of cases I'm thinking about, and I discussed this in my empathy book, are cases, we'll go back to free speech, where there's all sorts of things you could say on a college campus, you in particular, that would genuinely upset people, would
Yes.
genuinely cause them moral upset and harm. And somebody who's very concerned about it says, well, you shouldn't be allowed to speak. And while we're at it, Richard Dawkins shouldn't be allowed to speak either, because he got a lot of pain to people of faith, and so on and so forth. And the counter argument has to say, yeah, but there's certain broader abstract principles that in the very long run make things better. And I think that in some way you can be, just like you be too interested in egalitarianism, you could be too concerned about people's suffering.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also, I was actually having this conversation with my husband recently about foreign affairs, which he's more interested in generally than I am. And one of the reasons one of the reasons I do not envy world leaders and would not be well suited constitutionally to being a world leader and making decisions over the lives and deaths of strangers is that I find the suffering of even, this brings back to your empathy book, right? I find the suffering of even one child kind of overwhelms my senses and makes it almost impossible for me to make to think reasonably about the situation. Yeah, thinking about Israel and Gaza or something right now. We're on both sides. There has been suffering of children. I know as a woman and as a mother of a young child that, and as a pregnant woman as well, which I think also makes me more even more emotionally sensitive in this way. I basically can't pass that. So if I'm exposed to any of the images coming out of the region, I just want to weep, and yet you have to, if you are in a position of leadership, you have to make decisions which will sometimes result in that kind of suffering. And yes, it's a very good example, I think, of when empathy can actually end up being sort of disabling.
That's right. And I've seen that trajectory in my own life. I think I was a lot more cold-blooded up until the point I had children. And that in some way feminized me, maybe in a literal sense. I think there's evidence that men's testosterone drops when a kid. So my kids are now under 20, so maybe my testosterone is shot up again once they've left the house. But when I have kids, it softens one. And I would often, I would often hear about somebody's death and somebody, tragedy. I think, what if it was my kid, or that this person has parents who love them. There was some story that really moved me once I had kids, which is I forget who it was, some horrible dictator died, was murdered by his people. And his body was sort of left on the street, and his mother ran out and hugged him and screamed, "My beautiful boy, my beautiful boy." And it's the very fact that I'm moved by this says I think I may have more of a feminine morality than is optimal.
It's also such a the Christian resonance is unavoidable as well, right?
Yes, exactly.
The Pieta, yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think the problem there is that it becomes impossible to have a sense of scale, which one needs if you are making important decisions.
Yeah, I think in this modern world we live in, we actually have to say, well, we're going to do this, and it's going to cause 100 people to die, or in wartime, many, many more. But if you don't do that, if you can't do the moral math, you're going to make the world far worse. Um, so we can talk about Gaza, we talk about Israel, we talk about, I don't know, Barack Obama's drone attacks, and for everyone you can say, well, that was the wrong thing to do. But that kind of thing, where you go to war, where you decide to put money into vaccines versus into bridge repair or something, involve trade-offs of lives. And if you're not capable of doing that, you're not capable of being a good person, at least if you're in a position of power.
Or indeed, if you're not in a position of power. So let's go into why empathy is actually a bad thing. People tend to use it to mean like extra good sympathy.
Yeah.
But it has a specific meaning, right?
Yeah, I mean, my book was called Against Empathy, and I go back and forth thinking that's the best title ever, because look how much attention it got now. And that's the worst title ever, because people freak out and think I'm a pro-psychopath guy. The sense of empathy that I'm interested in, I'm against, is kind of this deep personal connection, putting yourself in someone's shoes, feeling what you believe that they feel. And it might seem like a strange thing to be against. It's like being against intimacy, because this is part and parcel of how we act around those we love. And I'm not against it in that way. I'm not against it. Having one of the joys of having a kid is feeling what that kid feels, like getting to see fireworks for the first time through their eyes, getting to watch the Hitchcock movies with them, that sort of thing. And one of the things about sports, about sex, is physical connection, that sort of empathy. But when it comes to making moral choices, it's an awful way to do it, because among other things, it's highly biased. There's a million laboratory studies, but also common sense says the kind of people you're going to put yourself in their shoes, you're going to feel what they feel. Are those close to you? Are those part of your group? Sometimes people say, for like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, oh, the Israelis lack empathy, the Palestinians lack empathy. But they have plenty of empathy. They just have empathy towards their own group, like everybody else. The architects of the Third Reich, these high-ranking Nazis, people, oh, they were monsters and everything. And in some sense, they were plainly monsters, but they have tremendous love for their countrymen, for their families. And there's no contradiction here. And in fact, it's not just there's no contradiction between empathy for those you love and cruelty to those who you don't, but there's sort of a connection where a very strong emotional tie to people around you is often accompanied with fear and resentment of those who could threaten them.
I suppose there's one way of looking at it, which is that so a sort of strong utilitarian outlook would definitely insist that empathy is bad and that favouring your in-group is bad, and that we ought to be as objective as possible and treat all humans as having equal moral worth. We know, of course, that humans don't operate like that. Not only that we assign greater moral value to people who are related to us because of the genetic investment component, but also people who are in our communities, whatever. We have these sort of concentric circles of moral concern, which extend out in the end to people on the other side of the world who we don't care about. Is there not an argument that that's good and natural and we just couldn't operate any other way? And that the person who would treat their own child as morally the same as someone's child on the other side of the world is in some sense completely morally deranged, and that they ought to be guided by empathy in that sense.
I think it's a hard problem. It's maybe the hardest moral problem. I mean, one way to think about it is, suppose you have 100 points, and you have to distribute them, and you distribute them to yourself. That's A. To those around you, B, and to strangers, C. What's the proper distribution? And there's no right answer. The answer for what you distribute to strangers shouldn't be zero. You shouldn't give no value to the suffering of people you don't know. On the other hand, giving the same amount to strangers and friends, I was having an argument or discussion with my friend Sam Harris, who's reasonably strong utilitarian, takes a strong view on that. And I was saying, burning building, rushing into the house, I'm going to save my kid before I save anybody else. In fact, I'm going to save my kid before I save 10 of anybody else. And he's saying, well, he understood the impulse, and but he said that's wrong. That's the wrong way to do. You should recognize that as wrong, and I don't.
No, me
On
neither.
the other hand, yes, right.
Yeah.
And it's somebody like Peter Singer would say, who's a philosophical utilitarian, very smart. He said, well, there's sort of a logic in favoring our family, an evolutionary logic, but we can sometimes reflect on these things and say that they're wrong. So that's one case where I wouldn't say it's wrong. But a case where I would say it's wrong is, say, ethnic and racial ties. So I think I could say that I'm willing to sign on to the idea of caring about my kids more than about strangers, but I don't think it's right for somebody like me to care more about white people than dark-skinned people. Even though you could tell a similar evolutionary account involving favoring one's tribe and one's group, I think we'd say, yeah, but it's not right. It's we should be as impartial as possible.
Could you also, as a play devil's advocate, though? I mean, ethnicities are in a sense large families, right?
Yes,
Like
that's right.
you're more genetically, you share more genetic material with someone of your ethnicity than someone who isn't, and this obviously the sort of further away the relationship, the more that's true. If we're going to permit people to favour their children, do we not also have to permit them to favour their ethnicity?
Yeah, good. So I think we're going to permit people to favor their children. And you could say, well, the conclusion there is we're favoring family over non-family. And then why draw the line? I'll favor my cousin over your cousin. I'll favor my third cousin twice removed. But I think the moral force behind favoring your children is ultimately doesn't have to do with family per se, or even or genetic ties per se, because it'd be your adopted child too. It has to do with sort of personal connection. It has to do with personal connections and feelings of obligation. So I guess I would say, as a thought experiment, if I found I had a child, suppose I don't know, I donated my sperm many years ago, and now I discover I have a child in a faraway land, a child, and quote unquote, who is half my genetic material. I don't think it's morally right to sacrifice two other people to save him. I think the moral specialness we have with our kids has to do with our connection to our kids, our personal connection. Does that ring true?
No.
Good. Okay.
I would favour the product of my gamete donation or whatever, even if I hadn't met them. I mean, I suppose, yeah. I mean, it's a numbers question, isn't it? I would favour my own, the child I had given birth to. I would favour over the child who was a product of my genetic donation, and then I would favour that person over some stranger. So I guess there is a hierarchy. Um, I think. I think we probably, maybe Sam Harris doesn't agree with that, but I think we probably agree with that. I agree the question is how to apportion, the question is how strict the hierarchy is and how much you're willing to, I mean, are you willing to, the thing is, of course, we do this all the time. As effective altruists will remind us, we will spend money on a toy for our child that they don't really need, and that money could have been spent on a mosquito net for a child in Africa that would save them from malaria, and yet people buy toys for their children every day of the week, and it's not considered to be morally reprehensible.
And the problem remains, even if like we agree on caring more about our own children, but suppose I'm heading home because I have a great toy and I can't wait to give it to my child, and some strange child is drowning on the side of the road, and I could spend a minute pulling him out of the water. No, my kid's more important. I'm going to bring him this new Nintendo game. That's crazy. That's crazy. In that case, the kid could wait. My own kid could wait. That's how I saved the stranger. So there's kind of a balance. I'm interested in our different intuitions here. I have a friend of mine who's very deep into sort of an egg donor process. And one observation which is interesting is often these young women who donate their eggs are quite interested in what's going to happen later on to the kid. And some of them will insist on future connection with the kid. I've never heard of a man who donates sperm having the same concern. It's almost like a joke. Like, I hope we let me know how the kid turns out and I want to contact him regularly and everything. Now, a simple story is it's a lot easier to donate sperm than donate an egg. But I wonder if it also suggests something. It would make sense that female psychology would be far more geared to, to offspring, the importance of offspring under any conditions, than male psychology. So I wonder it'd be interested to do a poll and see if we find, how much do you care that somebody is actually your biological child? How much of that race you're caring from? And it may be for women, it would be greater than for men.
That sounds right to me. And I don't think that the ease of retrieval is the factor, because you could also imagine a scenario where you had harvested eggs for your own IVF purposes, and then there'd been some extras that you'd sold or whatever, and it wouldn't have been an additional burden on you. I mean, so one way of looking at it is that women are primed to be more invested in their children, full stop. Another way of looking at it, of course, is that if men have a mode of sexuality which permits, wham bam thank you ma'am style casual couplings, they also must be tolerant of basically not knowing what happens to those children. So maybe men are capable of detaching in a unique way if they don't have any ongoing relationship with the mother. They can just not mind. They sort of have to not mind. If you're going to have casual sex in the
That's right.
pre-contraception.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. A mind that finds casual sex to be appealing has to be one that is relatively indifferent to the fate of the products of casual sex, which is why it tends to be far more appealing for men than for women.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, your answer is sort of a little bit more general and somewhat meaner than mine, which is men just care less about children, full stop.
No. I think it's more to do with the relationship with the mother. So if you're very invested in that relationship with the mother, then of course men are. Although of course it is also common to hear of men saying that when their children are born, even to their beloved wives, much wanted children, they don't feel a great emotional connection at first, and it takes some time to develop it. I've heard quite a lot of men report that. It's one of those things that's a bit stigmatized, so it tends not to be openly spoken about. Whereas women tend to feel an immediate emotional connection with their children, unless something goes wrong.
When my first kid was born, I asked my then wife if after he was like a month old, and I said, if one of us had to die, and before I finished the sentence, she said, "You," and I was shocked, because I was like, but me, I was like, okay, a kid, like I guess one day I'll grow to love the kid, and it was only much later for me for all sorts of reasons. You know, but it was much later for me. I actually started to love the kid as opposed to I suppose thinking I should love him, he's my kid and everything like that, but real love in the sense that I'd make the choice to save him rather than somebody than her came later.
Yeah, so maybe the male default is to be relatively indifferent, and then men develop passionate love for their children through context and exposure, which would mean that yes, not really minding about what happens to the sperm you donated. It is quite easy for most men.
Yeah. And, I would accept, I accepted the story of averages, which is on average, men are probably less attached to their children, fathers less attached to their children at every stage than mothers. But in defense of fathers, fathers can, like I feel this way with my own kids, have this intense love that I think culture identifies with mothers, but this intense love for their kids. But on average, it's not as much.
It's also possible that it's just a different type, and that maternal and paternal love just looks a bit different. I don't know if you've ever read Erica Commissar's work. She's
I
she's
haven't.
very she's a child psychologist. She's very interesting on different modes of if you give oxytocin to men, to mothers and fathers in a sample. I don't know exactly how you administer oxytocin. I'm sure you do. The
You
women will
you you
tend to
sniff it.
be okay, right. So you get them to huff oxytocin. The mothers will be more tactile with their children in terms of stroking and touching and kissing and whatever. The fathers will be more playful with their children. Will do things like tickle harder and for longer. So that suggests that our ways of showing love depends to some extent on sex. So it may be that it's not as if intensity is different per se in men who are very attached to their children. It's just that their mode of love is different.
That's super interesting. I wonder whether that would show up with other primates too. That the difference in modes of interaction.
You can see those lovely videos, can't you, of say gorilla dads play fighting with their gorilla babies, and it just looks so human.
Yeah,
So
that
I
sounds
guess there
great.
are lots of similarities. A darker question, but to some extent on the same theme, and it's something I've been, again, it's a hypothesis, I don't know if it's true, but I wonder what you think about it, about male sexuality. It is well known, I'm sure listeners know, that a lot of internet porn is very horrible and contains a lot of violence and aggression towards women. Not necessarily all by any means, but it's a marked theme that violence and aggression is to be found in online porn. I have wondered if, just as we know that men sort of have two modes of sexuality in relation to the long-term commitment sexuality and the casual sex, who cares what happens to my progeny mode of sexuality, and there's some men are obviously more suited to one or other at different times of their lives and so on. I've wondered as well if that also applies to sexual preferences during sex, so that men may essentially have a mode of sexuality which is how I like to have sex with my wife, and a mode of sexuality which is how I want to have sex with, and this is where it gets dark, the women of enemy men. Because we know that rape and warfare, for instance, is a very marked feature of our evolutionary history. And my hypothesis is that possibly online porn caters for that second mode, and that's why it's so aggressive.
It might be. So I do think plainly men and maybe also women, but men would have different sex with those they love and those that are in a long term relationship than say a prostitute. I think the most obvious one for prostitutes is a financial transaction. It demands long term. There's nothing long term writing on it. If there's no reputational issues, so the man might just be fairly indifferent to the woman's pleasure in a way that he wouldn't be for somebody he loved or somebody he wants to, impress at some level, or even somebody who's tied up in his friends group and wants to have a reputation as a good and caring lover. For a prostitute, you wouldn't have any of that, and it just made my financial. That doesn't speak to sort of the core of your question, because that wouldn't lead to violence or cruelty. It just leads to indifference, which is different. Um, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'd be hesitant to have an adaptationist story about a draw towards violence in sex. Um, just because I'm not sure there's much evidence either way. But you're right about the pornography. But here's the twist, and you must have come across this before, and I'm curious what you think about it. Very surprisingly, the appetite for more violent pornography seems to be more common in women than in men, both from the Pornhub data and also from
Yeah,
polling
yeah.
data and so
Of
on.
those women who watch porn, yes.
Yes, of those women who watch porn, that's
Yeah.
fair enough.
Yeah, yeah, no, it is an interesting finding. I mean, it's possible. There are a few ways of explaining it, I suppose. One is that women also do seem to have an interest in BDSM, which is quite pronounced, and you'll see it in even quite traditional romantic fiction. The sort of Mills. Do you have Mills and Boon in America?
It's a department store.
No,
No, sorry.
it's a genre of
I
like
really got it wrong.
sauce. It's like a genre of saucy novels. I think it's maybe I think it's an English brown. I might be wrong about that. Anyway, sort of.
I'll confess, I would think of Marks and Spencer.
I mean, yeah, it is. Yeah, it's confusing in that sense. It sounds very kind of ye olde timey, which it is in a sense. So anyway, Mills and Boon novels are all sort of highwaymen and pirates and all this kind of quite trashy erotic fiction, which has been written for decades, long before the internet, and it has quite sort of BDSM themes. So there's quite a lot of uh, forced sex that the woman actually secretly wants, basically. And one theory is as to why this is that women are attracted to displays of passion and strength, and those can be expressed through rape fantasies. That's not the same thing as women actually wanting to be raped, because obviously they don't want to have sex with men who they don't want to have sex with. That's circular, but I mean the rape fantasies are to do with men who they actually desire and who are very, very attractive. So it may be that's what's coming out in some of the women watching this violent porn. I mean, one more feministy theory is that it's because women who've experienced this stuff are kind of drawn to seeing it played out again. I've heard anecdotal examples of that being true. That probably doesn't explain all of it. I don't know what your view as a psychologist as to that theory. Are people drawn to representations of painful things they've personally experienced? The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.